Good afternoon, class. In today's presentation, we're going to go over, does exposure to combat or trauma fundamentally change moral decision making? For learning objectives, for this slide, for slide 1, we're going to try to understand and articulate basic principles of reasoning and critical thinking. I'll be discussing whether exposure to combat or traumatic experiences fundamentally change moral decision making. Specifically, I'll be focusing on trauma and how it can affect ethical judgment, empathy, and how individuals evaluate right and wrong after returning to civilian life. This topic is important because moral decision making is not only philosophical, but psychological and biological as well. For this, analyzing and advocating ideas and distinguishing matters of fact from issues of judgment or opinion when it comes to research questions. For this question, guiding this presentation is, how does repeated exposure to life-threatening or morally ambiguous situations in combat influence a person's moral reasoning and ethical judgment once they return to civilian life? This question matters because many assumptions exist about trauma and morality and psychology allows us to examine these changes systematically rather than relying on stereotypes or personal opinions. My position is that exposure to combat and trauma does not alter moral decision making. However, this does not mean that individuals lose their moral values. Instead, trauma reshapes how moral decisions are processed by changing emotional regulation, threat perception, and cognitive systems involved in ethical reasoning. Before moving into the evidence, I want to briefly clarify what psychologists mean by moral decision making. In psychology, moral decision making refers to how people evaluate right and wrong, assign responsibility, and make judgments that involve ethical and consequences. These decisions are influenced not only by values, but also by emotional regulation, threat perception, and cognitive control. This is important because it means moral reasoning is not purely rational or stable. It can change depending on context, stress, and experience. Understanding this helps why trauma can influence moral decisions without eliminating moral values. Neurological and cognitive changes. Constructing and assessing inductive arguments. Also, we'll be going over identifying hypotheses and evaluating evidences. One reason moral decision making changes after trauma is due to neurological and cognitive effects. Chronic exposure to stress areas of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is involved in reasoning and impulse control, while the amygdala plays a key role in emotional and threat responses. When these systems are repeatedly activated, decision making becomes more reactive and survival oriented, which can influence moral choices. Which can influence how moral choices are evaluated. Another reason is moral injury, which another important factor going over is more injury that occurs when individuals experience psychological distress after actions or situations that conflict with their deeply held moral beliefs. Research by Litz and colleagues show that moral injury can involve guilt, shame, and emotional numbing, and difficulty reconciling past actions with current values. This is significant because it highlights that trauma affects morality through conflict and emotional burden, not through a lack of ethical understanding. And we're going to watch a quick video on moral injury. This is on 2 times, so it's not 5 minutes.
Moral injury is when you do something, witness something, or learn about something that violates a deeply held moral code. It's this experience of being very disappointed in something that you've done or something that you didn't do, and often leads to people feeling this intense shame or guilt, and might lead to behaviors like withdrawing from society. So when we see people who feel moral injury, they might feel as if that the thing that they did has led to them being a bad person. And you might see them withdraw from their family or kids or doing things that are important to them because they don't want to contaminate other people. And so you might see them avoid going to the soccer game, avoid going to church, right? We see this withdrawal and this just self-deprecation and blaming and guilt. Moral injury shows up very commonly in military service members. So moral injury, the concept was first developed around the Vietnam era when veterans were coming back, maybe not qualifying for PTSD, but they were feeling as if the things that they did in a combat setting were just so different than the people that they wanted to be. A very common kind of experience that might lead to moral injury is when somebody is faced with the impossible decision of killing an enemy combatant and maybe injuring civilians, or leaving their brothers and sisters in arms open to being killed or injured. And that is an impossible choice. And there's really no right answer. And in the context of the military, of course, you're trained to protect your brothers and sisters. And so you have to make that decision. And so people, when people grow up, when you're a kid, nobody ever, on their kindergarten sign, nobody ever says, like, I want to kill people when I'm older. We learn to treat other people with compassion and kindness. And when you get into a situation where you have to make that decision, that leads to an injury because it's violating all those norms and the moral codes that we grew up with. Another thing that is common in the military and may lead to moral injury is military sexual trauma. And that is important to bring up because when you go to basic training or boot camp, you're indoctrinated into this code of conduct, these values, and especially that this is your family and you have each other's backs no matter what. And when a service member assaults another service member, the person who is the victim and becomes the survivor in that situation feels like there must be something wrong with me that I wasn't included in this sisterhood or brotherhood of the military, and that can lead to moral injury. The best thing that you can do to support anybody is to listen. Don't try to fix. When people try to fix problems, it actually ends up invalidating the pain that somebody's experiencing. Don't necessarily probe. Oftentimes, especially military veterans, don't want to talk about those experiences, but they might want to talk about pain. And so listen. And if they're willing and able, you can give them, information that could be helpful for getting treatment. At Rogers Behavioral Health, we have developed a military and veteran program specifically to help treat moral injury in our military and veterans. We're not trying to tell you what you.
Okay. Another reason, environmental adaptation, which is in extreme environments. In combat settings, decisions are often made under intense pressures with limited time and incomplete information. Ethical decision making becomes closely tied to survival, safety, and mission success. While these adaptations are functional in combat, they can create moral conflict when individuals return to civilian environments where ethical expectations and social norms are very different. To make this more concrete, consider how decision making works under extreme pressure. In high risk environments, decisions often must be made quickly with incomplete information and immediate consequences. In these situations, hesitations can be dangerous, so ethical decisions become tightly linked to survival and responsibility for others. Over time, this creates a moral framework that prioritizes minimizing harm in the moment. Even those decisions later feel morally complex when viewed from a different context. When individuals return to civilian life, these rules change. Decisions are often slower, consequences are less immediate, and moral expectations are different. These shifts can create internal conflict where actions that were once necessary are reevaluated through a civilian moral lens. This example is an illustration of how moral decision making is shaped by environment rather than the loss of ethical values. On to evidence. Well, here's some counter arguments. Training and discipline is starting one of them. Evaluating strengths and weaknesses of arguments, and also identifying logical limitations of fallacies is how we begin this slide. One counter argument is that military training emphasizes discipline, accountability, and ethical responsibility, which could protect moral reasoning. While training does provide structure and guidance, research suggests it does not fully prevent the psychological effect of trauma, especially in situations involving moral ambiguity. Training helps manage behavior, but it does not eliminate emotional cognitive strain. Another counter argument is individual differences. Well, not all individuals exposed to trauma experience changes in moral decision making. Factors such as personality, social norms, and belief systems play an important role. While this is true, individual differences explain variation in outcomes rather than the absence of trauma related moral change. The overall pattern remains consistent across research. Lastly, is post traumatic growth. Here we will be advocating ideas for support. Some research suggests that trauma can lead to post traumatic growth, including increased empathy or moral awareness. However, this growth often occurs alongside distress rather than replacing it. This means moral development and moral conflict can coexist rather than being mutually exclusive. What's important to recognize is that these counter arguments don't invalidate the overall conclusion. Instead, they highlight the complexity of moral development after trauma. Psychological research rarely supports absolute outcomes. Instead, it shows patterns and probabilities. While some individuals experience growth, others experience distress, and many experience both at the same time. Acknowledging these competing outcomes strengthens the arguments rather than weakening it because it reflects the nuanced reality of human cognition and moral reasoning. Qualifiers and assumptions. The severity and duration of trauma matter as do access to mental health support and social resources. This analysis also assumes that moral decision making is shaped by both neurological processes and environmental context. These factors help explain why experiments or experiences and outcomes differ across individuals. Understanding how trauma affects moral decision making has important implications beyond individual psychology. At a clinical level, it helps maintain health professionals distinguish between moral injury and other forms of trauma, allowing for more effective treatment. At a societal level, it can reduce stigma by reframing moral struggles as psychological responses to extreme environments rather than personal failings. Finally, from the educational perspective, this research emphasizes the importance of preparing individuals from ethical reintegration, not just physical or occupational reintegration. In conclusion, exposure to combat and trauma reshapes moral decision making through neurological changes, emotional conflict, and environmental adaptation. Understanding these effects helps reduce stigma and supports more effective reintegration and mental health care for those transitioning back to civilian life. Rather than viewing trauma as a moral failure, psychology allows us to understand it as a complex cognitive and emotional process. Thank you for listening and have a good day.